You haven't done so well yourself by telling...
Well, I can go back, I think, further than Donald. I know his family goes back as far as I do.
Irene Ryan was one of the most recognizable faces on television, best known as a feisty, no-nonsense granny who lit up screens and living rooms across America. Week after week, she made the nation laugh, but behind the wild wig and razor-sharp wit was a woman carrying quiet burdens. Offscreen, Irene wrestled with deep insecurities, an unshakable loneliness, and the haunting question of whether she was ever truly seen. What really happened to Granny Daisy? How did someone so beloved by millions leave this world in such silence? In the end, there was no family waiting by her bedside, nowhere to keep the lights on in the home she left behind. And when the news of her passing faded, so too did much of the life she had built. Contrary to the fame and height she would eventually reach, Irene Ryan wasn't born a star. She grew up in a modest Texas home where discipline spoke louder than dreams. Her father, a U.S. Army sergeant, carried military discipline into their household, and Irene's childhood was marked by strict expectations of obedience and modesty, leaving little room for aspirations of the stage. Still, she showed early signs of being different. At just 11 years old, she entered a local singing contest with the song Pretty Baby. Her performance not only won her the contest and $3 in prize money, but also gave her a taste of applause, admiration, and the thrill of connecting with an audience. That small moment planted the seed for a career that would span more than 5 decades. As she grew older, the structured world of her youth gave way to the unpredictable, demanding life of vaudeville. Irene had a natural knack for comedic timing and stage presence, which earned her a place in traveling vaudeville circuits where she sang, danced, and cracked jokes to live audiences nationwide. During this period, she met and married fellow vaudevillian Tim Ryan, forming a husband and wife comedy duo that found success in clubs and theaters. Their act, filled with rhythm, chemistry, and quick-witted banter, caught the attention of producers. Though their marriage ended in divorce in 1942, the partnership helped open doors for her career. By the 1940s, Irene had moved into radio, then the dominant entertainment medium. A pivotal break came when she began performing with Bob Hope, joining him on USO tours to entertain American troops overseas during World War II and later becoming a fixture on his radio show. Her sharp voice and comedic timing stood out, and her 2-year run with Hope's program was a significant accomplishment in an era when steady radio work meant steady fame. Her transition to film and television in the 1950s and early 60s was gradual but deliberate. Though she never became a Hollywood A-lister, she was rarely without work, often cast as feisty mothers, nosy neighbors, and sharp-tongued older women. Her big break came in 1962, when producer Paul Henning was developing a new sitcom, The Beverly Hillbillies. For the role of Granny Daisy Moses, the tough, witty matriarch of a poor Ozark family who strikes oil, Henning considered Irene, though many thought she was too young at just 59 to convincingly play an elderly grandmother. Determined to prove herself, Irene auditioned with her hair pinned tightly in a bun, no makeup, and an unrelenting commitment to the role. Her small frame, fiery energy, and natural comedic instincts brought Granny to life. Even B.A. Benaderet, originally considered for the role, agreed Irene was perfect for it. That single audition changed her career forever. From the very first episode, Irene stole the show. Though she played a woman 2 decades older than her real age, she embraced the gray wig, the harsh bun, and the high-pitched hollering with gusto. Audiences fell in love with Granny Daisy, sharp, stubborn, and fiercely protective of her family. Her years of vaudeville and radio had refined her timing, making every punchline land. Even with a strong ensemble cast, many fans and critics credited Irene's portrayal as one of the show's greatest strengths. Behind the scenes, she was known for being punctual, professional, and kind, never acting like a diva despite her newfound fame. When the Beverly Hillbillies premiered, it was an instant rating phenomenon, dominating Nielsen charts and redefining the American sitcom. But what truly made Granny unforgettable wasn't just the slapstick or corny jokes. It was the force of Irene Ryan's personality behind the character. She made Granny real. Audiences laughed at her antics, but they also believed in her. The show ran for 9 seasons, and Irene stayed with it the entire time. By the time it ended, she had received 2 Emmy nominations for her wake, recognition that validated what her fans already knew. She was one of the best comedic actresses of a generation, even if the industry hadn't always treated her that way. But while her star had finally risen, not everything behind the scenes was as bright. Once the camera stopped rolling and the laughter faded, Irene returned to a personal life marked by loneliness, quiet disappointment, and private struggles she kept mostly hidden. Behind the booming voice, comic timing, and unforgettable presence of Granny Daisy was a woman navigating insecurities, pressure, and personal pain that fans never really saw. Irene, who had spent decades climbing her way up through vaudeville and radio, never fully let her guard down, even after achieving the kind of success many actors only dream about. On the set of the Beverly Hillbillies, she was a consummate professional, but inside she was still afraid. Even as one of the most recognizable faces on television, she constantly worried she was too old, no longer funny enough, or at risk of being cast aside by Hollywood, which was notorious for discarding aging actresses. While others settled into the comfort of a long-running hit, Irene never allowed herself that luxury. Her work ethic was relentless, driven not by ego but by fear being seen as dispensable. Off-camera, the pressures of her career seeped into her personal habits and health. Irene was a heavy smoker, a common practice in the industry at the time, but one she relied on not just socially, but as a coping mechanism for her stress and nerves. Crew members often recalled how she would smoke endlessly between takes, a habit that gave her something to do with her hands, but also steadily eroded her health. Compounding this was a frustration of typecasting. Playing Granny made Irene Ryan famous, but it also trapped her. Despite her range as performer, comedy, drama, singing, and live stage work, casting directors and audiences increasingly saw her only as Granny Daisy. Though she had toured with Bob Hope, played Broadway stages, and entertained troops overseas, producers couldn't see past a gray wig and hollering voice. Irene admitted in later interviews that this hurt. She had built a versatile career, but the strength of her most famous character made it nearly impossible for people to see her as anything else. This struggle connected to something even more personal, her self-image. Irene had never considered herself traditionally beautiful, at least not by Hollywood standards. Surrounded by glamorous leading ladies of the era, she knew she didn't fit the mold of a romantic lead. Instead of giving up, she leaned into comedy, using her looks to her advantage and turning them into part of her strength. She let the audience laugh with her, and sometimes at her, making it part of her appeal. But the insecurities never truly disappeared. She carried them year after year, hidden behind costumes, wigs, and quick-witted jokes. In an interview, she once remarked, "The less beautiful you are, the harder you will have to work developing yourself. But far better than depending on beauty for everything. What will you have when that fades?" It was a reflection of her resilience, but also of the self-doubt that followed her everywhere, into roles, press interviews, and backstage solitude. Irene also struggled with the demands of fame itself. A natural introvert, she found public appearances exhausting. While she could command a stage with unmatched energy, she often retreated backstage the moment the cameras stopped rolling, preferring quiet corners to red carpets. Fame gave her visibility, but not always connection. That isolation weighed heavily on her, a burden that never fully left. Still, she never let it show on set. For someone who made millions laugh, she carried a surprising amount of personal tension. Perhaps the clearest reflection of this emotional weight was in her love life. For all the energy Irene poured into her career, her personal life often felt unfinished, marked by failed marriages, emotional distance, and a lingering loneliness. Her first marriage was to fellow vaudeville performer Tim Ryan in 1922, when she was still in her early 20s and building her name in live entertainment. Their relationship was built as much on their shared professional life as on romance. As a comedy duo, Irene and Tim Ryan toured, performed, and developed routines that became popular with live audiences. Yet behind the polished stage chemistry, the marriage was far from perfect. After more than 20 years together, they divorced in 1943. There were no children from the marriage, and though their romantic bond ended, they didn't completely sever ties. On occasion, they continued working together, maintaining professional relationship long after their personal one had dissolved. For Irene, it was a clear reflection of a tendency to prioritize the job over emotional closure. If a partnership worked on stage, she wasn't willing to abandon it simply because the offstage relationship had failed. A few years later, in 1946, Irene married Harold Knox, a man outside the spotlight who worked in film production. At first, it seemed like a welcome change from the showbiz dynamics of her first marriage. But that union, too, would eventually crumble. The couple divorced in 1961, once again with no children and little public drama. After her second divorce, Irene never remarried, and in the decade that followed, she had no known long-term relationships, public romances, or whispers of rekindled love. She rarely spoke of it, either to the press or her co-stars. If she felt sadness about being alone, she never made it anyone else's burden. Those close to her suggested that she simply poured everything she had into her wake. Performing gave her structure, identity, and purpose, but it also meant she often ended up alone once the curtain closed. Without a spouse or children waiting at home, her life revolved around scripts, schedules, and eventually silence. Though she was often surrounded by castmates and colleagues, Irene's personal life remained unusually quiet. Friends described her as warm but guarded, someone who gave her all to her craft while keeping her heart carefully protected. But behind the laughter and the roles, a quiet loneliness lingered, an ache that applause could never drown out. Whether that solitude was a choice or simply what remained after 2 failed marriages is difficult to know. What is clear is that Irene Ryan lived much of her life alone, a fact that would take an even greater weight as her health began to fail and the final chapter of her life quietly unfolded. By the early 1970s, Irene had entered a different phase of her career. The Beverly Hillbillies had ended in 1971, but she wasn't ready to slow down. Performing had been the rhythm of her entire adult life, and retirement was not something she considered. At 70 years old, she was still sharp, active, and eager to work. When the chance came to perform on Broadway, she embraced it as an opportunity to prove she still had more to give. That opportunity came with Pippin, one of Broadway's biggest productions at the time. Irene was cast as Berthe, the grandmother, a relatively small role, but one that included a show-stopping number, No Time at All. The song required charm, humor, and presence, all qualities Irene carried in abundance. She joined the national tour in early 1973, performing live once again as she had in her vaudeville days. But behind her radiant stage presence, Irene was quietly struggling. She had been feeling unusually tired, plagued by headaches, and at times suffered from confusion. Friends noticed, but Irene, ever the professional, brushed it off and refused to let anyone believe she couldn't keep up. Then, on March 10, 1973, during a performance in Washington, D.C., tragedy struck. Irene collapsed mid-show, shocking both the cast and audience. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors initially suspected exhaustion, but tests soon revealed something far more serious. She had suffered a stroke. Worse still, doctors discovered she was battling an inoperable glioblastoma, an aggressive form of brain cancer. As if that weren't enough, she was also diagnosed with arteriosclerotic heart disease, a condition restricting blood flow and further weakening her body. The symptoms she had hidden, headaches, mental fog, fatigue, suddenly made devastating sense. But by then, it was too late for treatment. The cancer had advanced beyond the possibility of surgery, and with both her brain and heart failing, Irene's body was already shutting down. She was transferred to a hospital in Santa Monica, California, where she spent her final weeks under care. The woman who had once brought so much energy and joy to America's living rooms was now bedridden, fading in silence. There were no dramatic headlines, no frenzied press coverage. News of her condition spread slowly, and her passing approached with a quietness that stood in stark contrast to the laughter and vitality she had given to millions. Irene herself, true to form, kept her final days private. On April 26, 1973, she passed away in Santa Monica at the age of 70. Her death was quiet, mirroring much of her personal life, away from the spotlight, but deeply felt by those who knew her well. She had spent decades making people laugh, and now, without much warning, she was gone. Irene was laid to rest in a simple mausoleum crypt at Woodlawn Memorial Cemetery in Santa Monica. There were no public processions, no televised funerals. Fans sent condolences, letters, and tributes, many shocked to learn she had been ill at all, since she had seemed so full of life right up until her final performances. While her death didn't dominate headlines like some of her peers, it left a mark on millions of Americans who had grown up watching her. Newspapers across the country published brief obituaries, remembering her as Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies. Fans mourned her as a comic legend, a TV grandmother who felt like family. Yet the contrast was striking. For someone who had lived so much of her life in the public eye, her final days were startlingly private. As the weeks passed, another story emerged, the fate of Irene Ryan's home, belongings, and fortune. Irene had no children, no surviving spouse, and no heirs. Her parents and her beloved sister Anna had already passed. After a lifetime of tireless work, from vaudeville stages to radio, film, television, and Broadway, she left behind considerable fortune but no one to inherit it directly. Her California home, the one stable place she had built for herself, sat eerily still. There were no family members to move in, no daily visitors, no next generation to claim it. For fans of the Beverly Hillbillies, the silence of her personal life was almost unimaginable compared to the larger-than-life character she had created on screen. But Irene's story didn't end in emptiness. Though she had kept much of her private world guarded, she had been deliberate about her legacy. In her final legal arrangements, she directed that her entire estate, valued at about $1 million at the time, be donated to the arts. More specifically, she created the Irene Ryan Foundation, a philanthropic legacy dedicated to supporting young actors. The cornerstone of this decision became the Irene Ryan Acting Scholarship, awarded annually through the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival. This scholarship continues to provide opportunities for student actors across the United States, helping them pay tuition, pursue training, and open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Since its creation, thousands of students have benefited from Irene's generosity. Some have gone on to become professional actors, while others use the support to finish their degrees or pursue careers behind the scenes. Many of them never saw the Beverly Hillbillies, and fewer still knew the full story of the woman behind the name. But her legacy lives on in their auditions, workshops, and performances, an invisible thread connecting generations of artists more than 50 years after her passing. It was a fitting legacy for someone who, deep down, never truly wanted to stop performing. Even in her 70s, Irene was still learning lines, taking roles, and staying backstage long after her scenes had ended. During the national tour Pippin, she often lingered with the younger cast and crew, chatting, laughing, and watching the show unfold from the wings. That spirit wasn't new. Through vaudeville, Bob Hope's radio shows, and her Emmy-nominated run on television, Irene had always seen performance as a craft, not just a career. And in the end, she left behind more than just money. She left behind a system of support for future performers, a chance for them to chase the same dreams that had carried her from a small Texas childhood to the living rooms of millions. What most people didn't see was how much Irene Ryan actually needed the spotlight, not just for the fame or the paycheck, but because it gave her purpose. She wasn't someone who could sit still in retirement or fade gracefully into obscurity. Off camera, she was often restless, scanning scripts, chasing roles that never came, or worse, roles that were just more the same. The industry had frozen her in time, casting her forever as a feisty grandmother, never as a woman behind her. Her wealth, while modest by Hollywood standards, had been carefully built over decades through multiple income streams. Her salary from the Beverly Hillbillies, earlier work in radio and vaudeville, Broadway stage performances, and paid appearances in Las Vegas. She had also invested in real estate and other assets, ensuring her financial independence well into old age. Her house was eventually handled through her foundation and legal representatives, and the eerie silence surrounding it, sparking speculation at the time, had more to do with the absence of family than with neglect. In the end, it wasn't haunted by sadness. It was simply waiting, like everything else Irene left behind, to be quietly sorted out. And in that silence, there's a kind of poetic symmetry. Irene Ryan had spent her life in front of audiences, making people laugh, bringing characters to life, and performing on every kind of stage. But when she was gone, she didn't ask for applause. She didn't leave behind a shrine to herself or demand posthumous tributes. She left something more valuable, a gift for others. Although she never had children of her own, in a way she chose to invest in the children of the future, performers she would never meet whose stories were just beginning. So while the world may remember her as a loud, fiery, and unforgettable Granny Daisy, the real Irene Ryan left behind something far more enduring, a quiet, powerful legacy that still shapes lives today. And in the end, she didn't need a packed funeral or a final curtain call to be remembered, because her greatest performance lives on in every young actor chasing a dream, just like she once did.